Stand in the center of Moscow today, and you are standing at the heart of the largest country on earth. You are surrounded by the history of one of the most powerful and enigmatic nations the world has ever known. This is a city of more than 13 million souls. A city of oligarchs in glass towers and pensioners in Soviet-era apartments. A city where the gold-leaf domes of ancient cathedrals stand just a few kilometers from the brutalist concrete of the 20th century, and where both now compete for skyline space with the shimmering, futuristic spires of Moscow City. It is a place of immense wealth and deep poverty, of avant-garde art and fierce political conservatism. On any given night, you can hear opera at the Bolshoi Theater or underground punk rock in a basement club. The languages spoken here are countless. Russian, of course, but also Tatar, Ukrainian, Armenian, Chechen, English, French, and the languages of the former Soviet republics that still look to this city as a metropolis. Moscow is a vortex, a place that has, for 1,000 years, pulled people in from thousands of miles of forest, steppe, and mountain. But rewind the clock. Not just a few decades, not just a century. Rewind it 900 years. The year is 1147, and if you stood in that exact same spot, the spot where the president now has his office, where parades roll across the cobblestones, you wouldn't hear a city. You would hear wind in the pine trees. You would be standing on the banks of a river so clear you could drink from it, looking at a steep hill covered in a dense forest. The Borovitsky Hill, the hill overgrown with pines. There was no stone here, no iron, no walls. Just earth, water, and an endless primeval forest. What happened in between? How did a muddy, wooded hillfort become the so-called Third Rome? How did it survive the fire of total annihilation, the iron grip of the Mongol horde, the ambitions of mad Tsars? The invasion of Europe's greatest conqueror, and the collapse of the empire it once ruled? This is not just the history of a city. This is the history of an idea. An idea that a small outpost on the edge of a forest could become the center of the world. For centuries, we've had to imagine these earlier versions of Moscow. We've had the faded icons, the sketches of foreign travelers, the descriptions in ancient chronicles. But now, we can take those descriptions and see them come to life. The log cabins, the mud streets, the white stone walls rising from the earth, the fires that turned it all to ash. Using the latest historical research and cinematic reconstruction, we can walk those streets. You are about to witness nearly 900 years of history in one video. Sit back and relax. As we journey through the incredible, turbulent, and dramatic history of Moscow, the capital of Russia. Let's go back to where it all began. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a line in a chronicle. The year is 1147. A prince named Yuri Dolgoruki, Yuri the Long-Armed, sends an invitation to his ally, Prince Sviatoslav. He writes, simply, "Come to me, brother, to Moscow." This is the first time the name Moscow appears in the historical record. At this point, it's not a city. It's a frontier estate. A wooden fort, a few huts, a stopping point for traders and soldiers. On the muddy roads between Kiev, Vladimir, and Suzdal, Yuri's Moscow was a speck in a vast forest. Just 9 years later, in 1156, Yuri ordered the construction of the first fortifications, a wooden Kremlin. The word Kremlin simply meant fortress inside a city. This first one was a simple affair. Earth ramparts topped with a stout log palisade. It was built to assert control and protect the growing settlement. So why here? Why did a city sprout on this particular bend in the river? Look at a map. The Moskva River flows into the Oka, and the Oka flows into the Volga. The Volga is the highway to the Caspian Sea, to Persia, to the entire Arab world. This spot, this Borovitsky Hill, was a perfect transit point. A short portage connected it to trade routes heading north to Novgorod and the Baltic. Moscow was born as a trading post, a place where furs from the north could be exchanged for honey, wax, and grain from the south, and for silver and silks from the distant east. For the first 80 years of its life, Moscow grew slowly. It was a typical wooden Russian town. Imagine it. Streets paved with logs, houses made of pine logs chinked with moss. The smell of wood smoke, pine tar, and bread. The sound of axes and hammers was the city's constant heartbeat, because in a wooden city, you are always building, always repairing. The population was maybe a few thousand, but this quiet, provincial life was about to be violently extinguished by a force so immense and so alien that it would reshape the destiny of everything it touched. In December 1237, the winter was particularly brutal. The rivers, which usually served as defensive barriers, had frozen solid, becoming highways of ice. And riding on that ice came the horde. The armies of the Mongol Empire, led by Beta Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. They had already sacked the great city of Ryazan. Now they were marching towards Vladimir, and Moscow lay directly in their path. The Mongols were unlike any enemy the Russians had ever faced. They were not a disorganized rabble. They were a highly disciplined, terrifyingly effective military machine. Their composite bows could outshoot any European weapon. Their horsemen could live for days on Mari's milk and blood, sleeping in their saddles. And they came not in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. The Prince of Vladimir had left Moscow with a small garrison and his young son Vladimir in charge. When the Mongol vanguard appeared out of the snowy forests, the Muscovites shut their gates. They fought. For 5 days they held off the greatest army in the world from behind their log walls. It was hopeless. On the 5th day, the Mongols breached the walls. They burned the city to the ground. Every building, every house, every church was consumed by fire. The young Prince Vladimir was captured and later executed. The population was either slaughtered or herded into slavery, marching east into the frozen unknown. For a moment, Moscow ceased to exist. It was wiped from the map. Archaeologists digging beneath the modern Kremlin have found that layer of ash and charcoal, the physical evidence of that first, complete annihilation. It's a stark reminder that in the early 13th century, Moscow's future was far from certain. It was just another pile of ashes on the long road to oblivion. But ashes are fertile, and rivers, as we will see, have a way of attracting people back. The rise of a princely seat. For decades after the Mongol invasion, the site of Moscow was abandoned, haunted. The Rus people, survivors, were subjects of the Golden Horde, paying tribute and bowing to the Khan. Power shifted to Vladimir and Tyr, but the forest reclaimed the hill. Then people slowly trickled back. The true rebirth began with Daniel, youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, who inherited a ruined Moscow. Daniel, patient and determined, became the true founder. He repaired fortifications and attracted settlers. He built Moscow's first stone church, the Cathedral of the Transfiguration of the Savior. Daniel and his successors played a brilliant political game, becoming chief tax collectors for the Mongols. They traveled Russian lands, collecting heavy taxes, sending the required amount to Sarai. By the mid-14th century, Moscow was strong enough to push back. Dmitry, Ivan Kalida's grandson, defied the horde. In 1380, Russian princes united under Moscow's banner to meet Mamai's massive army. The Battle of Kulikovo was a slaughter, a clash of titans, fought in late summer. an ambush regiment crashed into the Mongol rear. Mamai's army broke and fled. Dmitry Donskoy won a historic victory, ending the myth of Mongol invincibility. 2 years later, Khan Toktamish launched a surprise attack. Muscovites shut themselves inside new walls. Dmitry built a new fortress, not of wood, but brilliant white limestone. The first stone Kremlin. Moscow was a city of white stone, a symbol of defiance. But these walls were not enough. Moscow was sacked and burned again, but the destruction was not total. It rebuilt, stronger than ever. By the 5th-10th century, the Golden Horde was breaking apart. Ivan III, Ivan the Great, rose to power. Ivan III stopped paying tribute. In 1480, the Mongol yoke ended after 240 years. Ivan the Great married Zoe Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Moscow became the Third Rome. Moscow, the last bastion of true faith, destined to be the capital of the world. Ivan invited Italian architects, tearing down old walls to build new ones, the Kremlin we see today. These red brick walls with swallow-tailed crenellations resemble castles of Milan and Verona. Within, Ivan built cathedrals. The Dormition Cathedral, where all Tsars would be crowned. The Cathedral of the Annunciation and a new palace of facets. The Kremlin became a walled city. Ivan the Great's grandson, Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, pushed this power to extremes. In 1547, at 16, he crowned himself the first Tsar of all Russia, claiming Rome and Byzantium's legacy. He was intelligent, devout, but prone to paranoia and terrifying rage. He conquered Tatar Khanates, opening the Volga River and pushing Russia's border to the Urals. To commemorate Kazan's capture, he commissioned St. Basil's Cathedral, a fantastical building. Legend says Ivan blinded the architects, capturing his awe-inspiring, ruthless spirit. Later, Ivan's paranoia spiraled into madness. He created the Opryknina, a personal police state. In 1570, he sacked Novgorod in an orgy of violence, massacring thousands. Moscow lived in fear. In a fit of rage, he killed his own eldest son and heir. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, he left a country exhausted, terrorized, and expanded. He left a Moscow of extreme piety, immense wealth, and dark, bloody terror. The stage was set for catastrophe. Time of troubles. Ivan the Terrible was succeeded by his feeble-minded son, Fyodor. When Fyodor died without an heir in 1598, the 700-year-old Rurikid dynasty came to an end. The question no one had dared to ask for centuries suddenly loomed. Who rules Moscow? The answer was 15 years of hell known as the Time of Troubles. A power struggle ensued. Famine gripped the land. Crops failed for 3 straight years. From 1601 to 1603, people were reduced to cannibalism. Starving peasants fled to the forests or joined roving bands of bandits. Society was unraveling, and then came the pretenders. Men claiming to be Dmitry, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son. He had died in a mysterious accident years before. The first false Dmitry, backed by the powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. With a motley army of adventurers, he marched on Moscow. In 1605, he actually succeeded in taking the throne. He ruled for less than a year before he was exposed. Despised for his Polish ways and his Catholic sympathies, the Bayars had him murdered. His body burned, his ashes shot from a cannon towards Poland, the ultimate insult. But the Poles were not done. In 1610, King Sigismund III decided to intervene directly. The Polish army marched into Moscow and seized the Kremlin. They intended to place a Polish prince on the Russian throne. The heart of Russia, the Third Rome, was occupied by foreigners and Catholics. The state had effectively ceased to exist. It seemed like the end. But the idea of Moscow as a national center had sunk deep roots. In Nizhny Novgorod, a butcher, Kazma Menin made a passionate plea to his fellow citizens. Sell your possessions, sacrifice your gold to raise an army to save Russia. A grizzled prince, Dmitry Pozarsky, was chosen to lead it. This was a people's army, a national militia not raised by the state, but by the people themselves. In the late summer of 1612, this army marched on Moscow. They fought the Polish garrison in the streets for months. Finally, in October, they stormed Kitty-Gorod, the merchant district adjacent to the Kremlin. The Polish garrison inside the Kremlin, starved and desperate, surrendered. Moscow was free. In 1613, a grand assembly of the land, the Zemsky Sober, elected a new Tsar. They chose a quiet 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov, whose father was a powerful bishop and whose great-aunt had been Ivan the Terrible's first wife. He was young, harmless, and untainted by the recent chaos. The Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for the next 300 years, had begun. Moscow had been saved by its people and would now be rebuilt by a new dynasty. The golden age of wood in the 17th century was Moscow's golden age of color and wood. Released from the trauma of the Troubles, the city exploded with life and creativity. It was a city of merchants and artisans. Foreigners who visited were stunned by its appearance. They called it Wooden Jerusalem, and it was wooden. The streets were paved with logs. The houses were log cabins, often decorated with intricate carved trim around the windows. The churches were built of wood too, and the best of them were things of breathtaking beauty, rising in tier upon tier of pointed gables and domes like fairy tale towers. The most famous, the Church of the Transfiguration on Kizzy Island, was built entirely without a single nail. But a wooden city is a city that burns, and 17th century Moscow burned constantly. Major fires swept through the city every few years, destroying entire neighborhoods. It was a cycle of build and burn, but the Muscovites, resilient as ever, just kept rebuilding. Moscow in this era was also a city of spectacle and faith. Patriarch Nikon, the head of the Russian Church, reformed the liturgy to bring it in line with Greek practices. These tiny changes, how to make the sign of the cross, how to spell Jesus' name, caused a cataclysmic schism. Thousands of traditionalists, known as Old Believers, were excommunicated and persecuted. They fled to the edges of the empire, choosing to burn themselves alive rather than accept the new rites. The Kremlin's Dormition Cathedral was at the center of this spiritual earthquake. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, foreign merchants and soldiers were settling in their own district, called the German Quarter. It was a little slice of Europe inside Moscow, with its neat houses, Protestant churches, and different customs. Young Russian nobles would sometimes sneak there to experience this forbidden world of Western ideas. One of those young nobles was a boy named Peter. He would grow up to hate the stuffy, ritualistic, bowing and scraping world of the old Moscow court. He preferred the company of the foreign technicians and soldiers in the German Quarter. When he became Tsar, Peter the Great would take that fascination and smash it into the face of old Muscovy like a battering ram. He hated Moscow. For him, it was a symbol of everything he wanted to destroy. The conservative boyars, the Streltsy musketeers who revolted against him, the old traditions, the long beards, the flowing robes. Moscow reeked of the past. After finally defeating Sweden in the Great Northern War, Peter made a decision that changed everything. In 1712, he moved the capital. He declared that a brand new city, built on swampy land captured from the Swedes, would be the new capital of Russia. He named it St. Petersburg, his window on the west. For Moscow, it was a humiliation. It went from being the heart of the nation to a provincial backwater. The Tsar and his court left. The foreign ambassadors left. The grand construction project stopped. For nearly 2 centuries, Moscow would be in the shadow of its glittering European rival on the Baltic. But Moscow did not die. It slumbered. It remained the second capital, the place where Tsars were still crowned in the ancient Dormition Cathedral. It remained the center of the old aristocracy who built magnificent neoclassical palaces along its streets. It remained the center of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it remained a huge, thriving commercial city. While St. Petersburg was the official capital, Moscow was the real heart of Russia. It was here, in the salons and universities of Moscow, that a new Russian culture was being born. In 1755, the great scientist Mikhail Lomonosov, with the patronage of Empress Elizabeth, founded Moscow University. It was the first university in Russia, and it became a beacon of learning and enlightenment. This was the beginning of Moscow's identity as a city of intellectuals, writers, and thinkers. And then, in 1812, the sleeping giant was violently awakened by the most famous invader in European history. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River with the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 strong, they marched on Russia, pushing Russian armies back through bloody rearguard actions. By early September, Marshal Kutuzov fought a massive bloody battle at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. A horrific slaughter with 70,000 casualties, the Russian army was battered. Kutuzov decided to abandon Moscow. On September 14th, Napoleon rode up to Poklonnaya Hill, seeing Moscow's golden domes glittering in the autumn sun. He waited for the traditional delegation to bring him the keys to the city as in other conquered capitals. No one came. The city was empty. The vast majority of the population had fled. The next morning, fires began to break out, spreading with terrifying speed. By the second day, the entire city was an inferno. For 4 days, Moscow burned. Who set the fire? Napoleon blamed the Russians, calling it barbaric. Russians blamed French soldiers' carelessness. Historians believe it was a combination of both. Whatever the cause, the effect was catastrophic for Napoleon. 3/4 of Moscow was destroyed. 6,000 houses, 8,000 shops, hundreds of churches. The French army, hoping for winter quarters, found only ash and ruin, cold and hungry. Napoleon waited in the Kremlin, hoping the Tsar would sue for peace. Tsar Alexander I refused to answer. After 5 weeks, as snow fell, he realized his position was hopeless and ordered the retreat. The demoralized Grande Armée marched back through the snow and ice of the Russian winter. Harried by the Russian army and peasant partisans, fewer than 100,000 made it back out. Moscow had saved Russia again. Its sacrifice broke the back of the most powerful military machine. The fire of 1812 is the most dramatic, tragic, and heroic moment in the city's long history. After the fire, Moscow rose from the ashes once more. The rebuilding took decades. The old medieval street plan remained, but new empire-style buildings transformed the city. The defining change was social. Old aristocratic Moscow faded, replaced by a new powerful merchant class. These men made fortunes in textiles, manufacturing, and trade, often from peasant backgrounds. Names like Tretyakov, Morozov, Shukin, and Mamontov became synonymous with Moscow. Pavel Tretyakov collected Russian art to create a national gallery, donating his collection in 1892. The Tretyakov Gallery remains the world's finest collection of Russian art. Sava Mamontov created an artist's colony at Abramtsevo, reviving traditional Russian crafts. The Morozovs and Shukins bought French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, hanging them in their mansions. This was the golden age of Russian literature, and Moscow was its heart. Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, and Tolstoy made Moscow the backdrop for their great works. By the end of the 19th century, Moscow was booming. The railway network radiated out. The first trams appeared. The Tretyakov brothers built the Tretyakovsky Proyezd shopping arcade. Entrepreneur millionaires built Art Nouveau mansions like Fyodor Shechtel's Ryabushinsky mansion. But this glittering surface concealed deep, violent tensions. Moscow was also a city of factories and a growing, radicalized working class. Vladimir Gilyarovsky chronicled the city's dark underbelly, the notorious Kitrovka market. In 1905, revolution broke out. Workers built barricades and fought the Tsarist police and army. The Presnya district was shelled into rubble. It was a dress rehearsal for the greater cataclysm to come. The old world was cracking, and Moscow was at the epicenter of the quake. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The new Soviet government was immediately vulnerable. German armies advanced. In March 1918, Lenin made a strategic decision, moving the capital back to Moscow. Moscow became the capital of the world's first socialist state. It was a return, but also a conquest. The new rulers viewed the old city with suspicion. The Kremlin, once sacred, was sealed off, a fortress. Bolsheviks launched a campaign to erase old symbols. Churches were closed, domes stripped of gold. Interiors turned into warehouses or factories. In 1931, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was dynamited. The plan was to build the Palace of the Soviets, a gigantic tower with a 100-meter statue of Lenin. The project failed, ground too wet. The intent was clear: old Moscow replaced by a new atheist Soviet Moscow. Under Joseph Stalin, the city underwent its most radical transformation since Ivan the Great. The 1935 General Plan aimed to turn it into a model socialist metropolis. Old winding lanes replaced by grand avenues for military parades. The Garden Ring was widened. Massive new buildings went up in Stalinist empire style, grandiose, classical, and intimidating. The Moscow Metro, opened in 1935, was Stalin's pet project and greatest gift to the city. It was not just transport. It was a propaganda tool called the Palace of the People. Stations designed by best architects, each a different theme, like Ploshchad Revolyutsy with bronze sculptures. To ride the metro was to travel through an underground museum of Soviet ambition. In 1941, Hitler's Germany launched an invasion. Operation Barbarossa brought the Wehrmacht to Moscow's gates. By October, the front line was 100 kilometers away. Government evacuated. Panic gripped the city. But Stalin stayed. On November 7th, he staged a historic military parade on Red Square. Troops marched past Stalin, straight to the front line. An act of immense psychological defiance. The German advance was stopped at the outskirts, at places like Krukovo and Khimki. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing Germans back. Moscow survived the greatest test. The war cost 27 million lives, but Moscow stood unbowed. After the war, Stalin celebrated victory by building. He commissioned the Seven Sisters, 7 massive wedding cake-style skyscrapers that still dominate the city's skyline. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Hotel Ukraine, Stalin's answer to New York's skyscrapers. A statement that the Soviet Union had arrived as a global superpower. Stalin died in 1953. His body lay in state, crowd so immense a stampede killed hundreds. The terror was over. Moscow was about to enter a new, strange, and contradictory era, the Soviet metropolis. The period after Stalin's death, the Khrushchev thaw, brought cautious opening. In 1957, Moscow hosted the World Festival of Youth and Students. The Iron Curtain lifted slightly. Muscovites saw foreign fashions, heard foreign music, talked to foreigners. It was intoxicating. This was also the era of mass housing. Khrushchev was determined to solve the housing crisis. The solution was the Khrushchevka, cheap, prefabricated, 5-story concrete apartment blocks. They were cramped and ugly, but gave millions their own front door. Moscow expanded into suburbs. The 1960s and 70s were a time of stability and stagnation. The Soviet system seemed permanent. New wide avenues were built. Kalinin Prospect was constructed as a modernist showcase. It was nicknamed Moscow's False Teeth for its jarring modernity next to the old Arbat. Beneath the surface, a different culture thrived, the Soviet intelligentsia. They listened to band songs by Vladimir Vysotsky and bootleg Western rock music. The streets around the old Arbat became the center of this unofficial culture. The dissident movement was born here. In 1980, Moscow hosted the Summer Olympic Games, a showcase of Soviet achievement. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led to a massive boycott by the US and 60 other countries. The Games went ahead, but were a pallid, politically charged affair. Misha the bear cried a giant tear. By the mid-1980s, the system was running out of steam. Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika. Suddenly, newspapers published articles about Stalin's crimes. Forbidden books appeared. The air in Moscow was electric with possibility and uncertainty. New cooperatives opened. Long lines for bread and basics grew even longer. The Soviet Union was coming apart. In 1991, hardliners attempted a coup to stop reforms and save the USSR. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Boris Yeltsin famously climbed onto a tank in front of the Russian parliament, calling for resistance. For 3 days, Muscovites gathered to defend the building, building barricades. The coup collapsed. Later that year, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. Moscow was once again the capital of a new, uncertain country, the Russian Federation. The 1990s were a wild, chaotic, and brutal time for Moscow. The fall of the USSR unleashed a flood of change. The first McDonald's had already opened in 1990, with lines stretching for blocks. Now, everything was for sale. Kiosks selling everything from vodka to electronics sprouted on every street corner. The city was a giant open-air market. It was also a city of stark, new contrasts. A tiny number of people became unimaginably rich almost overnight, the new Russians. They drove armored Mercedes, wore brightly colored suits, and built garish mansions outside the city. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people saw their life savings wiped out by hyperinflation and struggled to survive. Crime exploded. Gangster shootouts became common. The city felt dangerous, lawless, and free. In 1993, the conflict between Yeltsin and the conservative parliament led to another armed standoff. Tanks shelled the White House, the very building that had been defended just 2 years earlier. But out of the chaos of the 90s, a new Moscow began to emerge in the 2000s. With Vladimir Putin's rise to power, the state reasserted its control. The oligarchs were told to stay out of politics or face the consequences. The economy, fueled by rising oil prices, boomed. Moscow underwent another construction frenzy. The most dramatic symbol of this new era is the Moscow International Business Center, known as Moscow City. A cluster of ultramodern skyscrapers built on the banks of the Moskva River just west of the city center. The Federation Tower, one of the tallest buildings in Europe, soars over 370 meters. It is a direct challenge to the financial centers of London and New York, a statement that Moscow is once again a global city of capitalism and power. The old city center was also transformed. The authorities embarked on a massive program of beautification, which Muscovites call My Street. Sidewalks were widened, historic paving restored, thousands of trees planted. Ugly kiosks and billboards were removed. The city center became cleaner, more pedestrian-friendly, and more European than it had ever been. In a move of stunning historical irony, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, dynamited by the Bolsheviks in 1931, was rebuilt exactly as it was. funded by public donations and completed in 2000. It stands today, gleaming white and gold, a short walk from the Kremlin, and a stone's throw from the new luxury high-rises. Past and present, faith and commerce sit side by side. In 2012, a massive new development, Zaryadny Park, was opened on the site of the giant derelict Rossiya Hotel, right next to the Kremlin. It's a futuristic park with 4 different artificial climate zones, a floating bridge over the river, and a concert hall. It has given Moscow a new modern public space at its very heart. Stand on that bridge in Zaryadny Park today, looking at the Kremlin walls. Look to your right and see the golden domes of the cathedrals. Look to your left and see the glass and steel of Moscow City in the distance. You are witnessing 900 years of history in a single glance. This is a city that has been burned to the ground and rebuilt, not once but many times. It has been sacked by Mongols, occupied by Poles, burned by its own people to defeat the French, and bombed by Germans. It has been the center of a czarist autocracy, the heart of a global communist empire, and now the capital of a resurgent, complex, and often contradictory nation-state. It is a city of extremes. It can be breathtakingly beautiful and profoundly ugly. It can be open and welcoming and cold and suspicious, often in the same moment. It has produced some of the world's greatest art, literature, and music, and it has been the scene of some of history's greatest tragedies. Moscow has survived because of its location, its rulers, and its people. The river still flows. The hill still stands. The forest that once covered it is long gone, replaced by stone, steel, and concrete. But the story of that forest, of that small wooden fort on a hill, is still written into the very fabric of this vast, sprawling, and utterly unique metropolis. It is a city that will never stop changing, never stop surprising, and never stop being, for better or worse, the heart of Russia. Thanks for watching. Creating videos like this is a monumental task of research, writing, and visualization. It's a passion project, piecing together the fragments of a millennium into one coherent story. If you enjoyed this journey through Moscow's epic history, I would really appreciate it if you would hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest cities. And let me know in the comments which city you would like to see next. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the past.